it's a little bit boring just to have a single testimonial, right? That seems like only one person ever used our app and actually liked it. So I'm sure there's more than one person who likes our product, right? I hope so. So we're going to use something called the Bootstrap Carousel. And this is kind of like a slideshow that allows you to go through different content. And you've got the ones where it's kind of automated, like you've got over here. But you've got another one which is more manual, which is the one that we're going to use, where you can toggle through all the different slides. And in our case, each slide is just going to be a new testimonial from a new person so that we can show off how many people love our product. So let's first have a play around with it using code play. So if you go to the first example where there's slides only and copy the code here into a new code play playground, and of course remember to change your framework if you need to, and paste that code into the HTML section. So now let's hit run. Now it is working, but in this case, there's no source for the images, so they're not really showing up. Instead of looking for images and messing around with this, I'm simply going to select the carousel item, which is the class that is the div that contains each slide. And I'm simply going to give it a height of, say, 500 pixels. And I'm going to go into the div and I'm going to add an inline style. So style equals background color, red. And I'm going to add this inline style to all 3 slides. And the first one's going to be the red, second one's going to be yellow, third one is going to be blue. Hit run, and now let's pop it out to see what this looks like. So this is our first slide, which is red, and it says first slide. Our image is not working because we couldn't be bothered to find a valid image, but if you did put one in there, then it would work just fine. And now, after what seems like forever, our second slide has just slid into view. This one's yellow, this one says second slide, and if we have the patience and do not fall asleep before the third one comes along, then there we go. We've got a third slide as well. Now, it's a little bit slow, isn't it? And, you know, if you're on an actual website, it's probably not a great idea to have very fast carousels because it's kind of annoying. But how can you change the speed? Now, if we go into the Bootstrap documentation and we look at the usage options, which you can get to by clicking down here, then you can see that there's quite a few different options that we can actually change about these carousels. We can change, for example, the interval, which is the amount of time delay between cycling the items. Now, the default is 5,000 milliseconds. That's the unit here, even though it's not really said here. So 5,000 milliseconds is basically 5 seconds. Now, if we wanted to speed it up, we can change that interval to, let's say, maybe every second. So we go into the div that is our carousel, which is here. And as it says here, you have to append the option name, which is called interval, to data dash. So for example, data interval equals this. So we're going to go in here and we're going to add that attribute data dash interval. And we're going to set it to equal to 1,000, which is going to be 1,000 milliseconds, or basically cycling every second. So let's hit run. And now every second our carousel is changing its slide. Now, before I blind you, there's a whole bunch of other options that you can change. For example, should the carousel react to keyboard values? So for example, going left and right. Should it be paused when the cursor is hovering over the carousel? So let's go ahead and see what some of those things might look like. So let's, for example, add the one where we can pause on hover. So let's add the attribute called data-pause, and it's going to equal to hover. Now, if we hit run, our slides will continue going at the speed of light, but once I put my cursor inside it, then it will pause, which is quite a nice feature. And some websites are too lazy to implement this, which is really frustrating when I want to read what's on that particular slide in the carousel. Now, another thing that we can change is the slide class here. So if we removed that from the carousel class, then you can see that it no longer slides, but just changes to the next carousel item. But I quite like this sliding animation, so I'm going to put it back in. And the final one I want to show you is how do you stop this autoplay? Well, you can change ride. So data ride over here, if it's equal to carousel, will just autoplay. If it's set to false, then it will only play if you tell it to, through maybe the keyboard buttons or through some carousel buttons. So it's not autoplaying anymore. So how do we change the slides? How do we go from slide 1 to slide 2? Well, if we have a look in the docs, there's another type of carousel which has controls. So it has these buttons that lets us go between the different slides. And that's what I want to implement for our Tindog website. So how can we do this? So I want to have a static carousel that doesn't autoplay. So I'm going to leave data ride equals false. Now, I don't need a data interval anymore because that only applies to the animation of auto scrolling between the different slides. And data pause on hover I also don't need because it's stopped by default. So now if we look inside this example which has the controls, then you can see that the difference between this one and the previous one that didn't have controls is that it has some buttons down here. It has a carousel control previous and a carousel control next. So let's go ahead and copy these two buttons over to our code play. And you can see down here, they've put in it just above the last div. So we're going to do exactly the same. So now if we hit run and we pop it out, you'll see that we now have buttons, but they don't work yet. Now, the reason is because as with all of these Bootstrap buttons, they have a href that targets the carousel, and it needs to be the same name as the ID of your carousel. So for example, in this case, the ID is carousel example slide only, but this href is targeting something called carousel example controls. And that's because in the second example, the ID was called carousel example controls. So let's change this. Let's make it target something like just called testimonial carousel. And we can make that the same href for the previous as well as the next buttons. And of course, we need to change the actual ID of the carousel over here. So now, whenever each of these buttons are pressed, they target the carousel that we've got in place. And now if I run our code, you can see that when I press on the buttons, it actually changes through the slides. And it works both for the next and the previous buttons. Now, let's go through each and every line of this code just so that we understand fully what it's all about. So the first thing is a div that has the ID of the carousel. And this, of course, remember, needs to be unique across your page. Next, we add some custom Bootstrap classes, which is carousel, which says that this div is going to be a carousel, and slide, which, if you remember from earlier on, says that our slides should animate in from the right or left rather than simply just appearing. Data ride equals false means that it doesn't autoplay, so we've got that line sorted. Next, we've got the carousel inner, and this is going to contain the contents of the carousel items, so the slides that will be changed. Inside carousel inner, we've got 3 carousel items. And the first one, the first page that you want to show on your website, so when you load up your website, the first slide is marked with an active class. And you have to have one of these carousel items being marked as the active class. Now, the next thing is some inline style that we put in just to be able to distinguish the 3 slides from each other. And then inside each of these, we've got some content. So you can have an image or you can have, say, an H1. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't change anything about the carousel. And in fact, later on, we're going to be putting our custom testimonials inside here as the carousel item content. So we can ignore these images like here and here. Then we get to our two buttons. So the first button has the class carousel control previous, and that is this left button over here. And it has an href to know which carousel to target, because you can have multiple carousels in your HTML, right? So it needs to know which one it should affect. Then the role of it is the button. Now, ideally, you want to use an anchor tag as the HTML element that's going to be the button, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something like an H1 that you might want to assign the role of button to, right? So this is what it's all about. You have to add this role equals button to change our anchor tag into a button. Next is data slide previous. So this says which direction should your carousel slide. So this is going backwards and this one is going forwards. And the next line is a span, and this is the button icon. So this little arrow over here. And this comes from Bootstrap by adding in that class. And aria hidden equals true. Now, this is something that we saw in the nav bar as well, and we didn't really talk about it too much. But aria hidden basically means that when a visually impaired person comes across your website, they usually have something called a screen reader, which goes through the website and reads what is on there so they can hear what we can see. Now, for things like buttons, you don't really want the screen reader to read out left button, right button, or, previous button, next button. So you have this thing called aria hidden, which basically means make the screen reader skip over this button span so that the visually impaired person doesn't have to listen to what all the buttons are. And this goes towards, making your website more accessible and friendly to people with disabilities. And this is actually a really, really big topic and a really, really important topic as well. So you can either keep it in or you can delete it. But just remember about your users who might be visually impaired. Now, the last span that we see in here is called SR only. And this stands for screen reader only. And that is what we said before, right? So instead of telling the user that there is a carousel control previous icon button, instead it just says previous on the screen reader. So you can either delete this if you're not planning on being accessible to people who have visual impairments, or you can include it and make sure that your website is more inclusive. Now, in our case, I'm actually going to get rid of it just because we're learning something new and want to keep the code as clean and pure as possible. So now this is what we've got as our carousel, and this is what we would like to implement in our website. So I like to test out the code in something like CodePlay before I put it into the website when it starts interacting with everything else, and it could lead to issues. So I want to have a pure version that's just working exactly as I need it to, and then I can transplant it into the website. So let's go ahead and copy all of this HTML over here, and we're going to put it into our index.html for our Tindog website. And I'm going to place it inside the testimonial section, of course. So now you might notice that there is this section that has been commented out. So if you select it and you hold down Command on Mac or Control on Windows, then you press the / button, then it will uncomment it and take it back into the flow of our website. So we now have two testimonials. So we can change our code to have two carousel items. So I'm going to delete the third one basically. And the first one is no longer going to have the H1 of hello, but instead it's going to have this first testimonial with pebbles that we saw earlier on. And the second one is going to be from Beverly from Illinois. I feel like I'm on a game show. Beverly from Illinois, you have just won. Not very much. So now that we've updated that, let's just check to make sure that everything else is in order. And one thing that we've transplanted over that we don't really want or need are these inline styles. So we can get rid of our inline styles that changes the background color because we have a beautiful background color already. So let's hit save and let's hit refresh. And you can see we now have a testimonial. And if I go left or right, then you can see that it's scrolling through the two different testimonials I've got. And obviously, if you have more, then you can keep adding them in, right? And the nice thing is that all the styles that I added previously, because I've got all the classes in place in the second testimonial, I didn't have to add or change any styling at all. Now, there's just one last eyesore that I want to fix before we finish off this section. And that is, I'd really like these buttons to be further out here so that they're not so close to my testimonial text, because it looks a little bit weird to my eye. Now, the reason why that's happening is because our padding is applied to the testimonial section. So this entire section is the testimonial section. And if you have a look on Chrome Developer Tools, then you can see that it has quite a lot of padding around all four sides. And that is squishing in these buttons here. So in order to change that, we can apply the padding to only the parts that we want to be padded. So what we can do instead is we can apply that padding to each carousel item so that the content inside the carousel items are padded. So the H2, the image, and the EM, they're all bunched in the center. But to have the buttons outside of that padding so that it has more space and it's more visible and more easy to click on. So to do that, all we need to do is to target the carousel item, and we're going to move the padding from the testimonial section, which is section wide, to only inside the carousel item. So now if we hit save and refresh, then you can see our buttons are now all the way out here. And if you take a look at pesticide, you can see that the buttons are now occupying a much larger space and it's hard to miss. So if you click anywhere in this section, it will scroll through the testimonials. But our padding for our carousel items are still in place and it still looks exactly the way that it did before, just we now have more logically placed buttons. So I hope you enjoyed this section of learning about the Bootstrap Carousel, and it might be worth for you to have a play around with some of the other examples that they've shown inside your CodePlay playground. But in the next lesson, we're going to learn about another Bootstrap component, which is really, really useful, and that's the Bootstrap cards. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.